Hi there, and welcome to this episode of Research Insights Live. My name is Lynn Zebeda, and I'm super happy to welcome you here everyone here, everyone watching, to this episode on behalf of the ISS, the International Institute of Social Studies. Most of you here have heard of it. And our episode today is about the unseen faces of COVID-19, as you know. And with unseen faces, on the one hand, we mean unseen aspects that we don't think about a lot, so around climate, around water, inequality, education. But we also really mean just faces, human faces, because as we said to each other, you wake up every day, you see your own face in the mirror, every time the same face. And, you know, what is it like? What has the experience been like the last 2 years for people waking up in whole other parts of the world? So we're going to make this a very human conversation in that sense. And today is inspired by this new book. It's called COVID-19 and International Development, and it was edited by Eliseos Papirakis, who is right here with me at the table. Welcome, Eliseos.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for having me here.
Of course, yeah. And several other authors of the book will join us at this table, along with inspiring guests. We have people calling in from 4 different continents, actually. And we'd like to interact with all of you here, all of you watching. We have Mentimeter for that. It's a very handy tool. So you can go to menti.com and use this code, 77679309. So you go to menti.com and you use this code. Even us here, we can use that tool for all our questions and interaction. And actually, we want to test it out by asking a question to you guys, because we know that we have people watching from 34 different countries. That's the beauty of the ISS community, from Barbados to Myanmar to Somalia, Jamaica, Peru, the Gambia, Malaysia, Algeria, Taiwan, Andorra even, South Korea. So we're very happy to welcome you all here. And because it's such a special community coming together, we want to ask you, through Mentimeter, what unexpected impact did the pandemic have on your life or the lives of people you see around you, your community? So what unexpected impact did the pandemic have for you, on your life, on your community? And we'd love to hear your answers, because together we can see a lot more than we can by ourselves. And as we wait for your responses, I'd like to go and introduce the book to you, together with Eliseos. And Eliseos, let me say, you're a senior lecturer, development economics at the ISS. And of course, ISS is a part of the bigger Erasmus University. And I want to ask you, Eliseos, why, you brought everyone together to create this book. Why was it so important for you to do that?
Well, as you said in the beginning, we tend to see our own face every morning, and we know a lot about what's happening within our own borders.
Yeah.
We know how many people are in intensive care in the Netherlands, whether we need to wear face masks for public transportation, whether infections are rising or dropping. But we often lose sight of those unseen faces in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And that's quite important. And for those of us who study international development, there is a very important need of not losing sight of these unseen faces outside our borders. And these unseen faces are often the less privileged ones, the more vulnerable ones. So this book was put together to help us visualize these unseen faces,
yeah,
from different perspectives, from those who get affected with respect to gender inequality, climate change issues, water security.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And when you were reflecting on the process of, putting together this book, a few facts stood out for Eliseos, and you brought 3 facts with you. This is just kind of a taster to get our brains crackling a bit, and what are some of these unseen aspects then that we might have missed? So let's take a look. We have a first one, and it says the pandemic added an estimated 150 million people living in extreme poverty. And global poverty is rising for the first time since the year 2000. So it was going down, global poverty, since 2000, and now for the first time, there's a spike. Is that how I should understand it, Eliseus?
Yes, that's correct. So this is not one unseen face. It's actually 150 million unseen faces of new people in the developing world who will now be falling in extreme poverty as a result of the impacts of the COVID pandemic.
And extreme poverty living under?
Less than $1.90 per day per person. So that's quite dramatic.
$1.90
So
per
that's
day.
the absolute minimum income that you should have to basically be able to survive.
Yeah, exactly. And an extra 150 million people are now not able. Yeah.
So just to put things in relative terms, before the beginning of the pandemic, we had approximately 800 million people globally suffering from extreme poverty. Adding another 150 million, it's quite a dramatic
almost
increase.
1 billion people.
And it's the first time this happens. It's even more dramatic than what happened, let's say, during the global financial crisis in 2007-8.
Okay, wow. The first time since 2000 that this has happened. So that's a pretty gigantic aspect that I have not heard a lot about in any case. And I think this ties in with a lot of the themes that we'll speak about today. Let's look at your second one that you brought along. And it says, people in low-income countries with access to basic hand washing facilities. So how many people in low-income countries have access? It's 19.6%, which means 80% of people cannot wash their hands easily. Is that how we should interpret it?
Well, this is what this slide shows, right? That it's basically, it's another face less visible to many of us. 20% of the population in low-income countries, so think, for example, many of these are located in sub-Saharan Africa, are still lacking access to basic hand-washing facilities, which we know it's an important preventive measure against COVID. Again, to put things into perspective, the average distance that, let's say, a woman somewhere in rural Africa, in an underdeveloped place, because it's often women who have to walk long distances to collect water. Yeah. So the average distance is close to 6 kilometers.
Wow.
A woman needs to walk to collect water. Yeah. And sometimes, quite often, the weight that the women need to basically bear on their heads is as high as 20 kilos. Wow. So think about 20 kilos is the weight of the suitcase we normally check in, right? Just before we're about to fly.
And 6 kilometers with that. Yeah. Wow. We will have a lot of time to speak about this aspect more, actually, and see what it looks like, actually. And the last fact that you kind of wanted to, bring in at the beginning that you found important to highlight is this one. The mental well-being of LGBT individuals. Maybe you want to highlight it, yeah. So
I thought it was worth bringing attention also to these unseen faces within the LGBTQ community. Now, for most of us, for example, when there was a prolonged lockdown, I mean, so for the vast majority of us, this was simply a matter of inconvenience regarding not going out to eat in restaurants or canceling some trips abroad. But for a young LGBTQ person who lives within a conservative family or a conservative community, being in a lockdown deprives you of the opportunity to get out of your conservative family, get out of your closet, finally get your free breathing space, and being able to feel comfortable within your skin. Yeah. So it's not a simple inconvenience. It's something that provides you your freedom. Yeah, exactly. And you're really the core of your well-being. Yeah. So that's already, I don't know, had you guys thought about these aspects before? These three things? Not really, no, not really. And that's just the beginning of today. Thank you for kind of like putting us on the edge of our seats, Eliseus, for now. Let's see if the Mentimeter results are in. Yeah, some of them. So let's see, like the unexpected impact of COVID that you, the audience, have seen around you. Actually, a lot of unemployment. Hey, new love. That's a great one. Congratulations. Delayed higher education, extremely fragile public healthcare system that shows more even, of course. I delayed my higher education for my community, increased poverty and job loss, purchasing power, early marriages for girls, relocalization, showcasing the persistent inequalities in society. Poorer people have been impacted more.
the putting society in pause gave me a feeling of calmness and peace. So that's a whole other experience. Working from home, but a lot of societies, that's not even possible. So a lot of actually quite some things that come back a lot, like the increased poverty, the unemployment, the fragility, but the new love gives us hope. Thank you for sharing that, and we'll use the Mentimeter from now on to ask questions also to our speakers. So please, if you have a question, we'll incorporate them. You can direct it to one of the speakers, and we can have this conversation all together. So we are going to our first guest speaker. After that, we will go like topic by topic around inequality, around education, around climate and water. But we are really happy to start with this artist who is a very dear friend of mine as well, and who can help us see the human faces of this pandemic. I'd love to introduce you, Nelia Sabnis. Hi, Nelia. Hello, welcome. Calling in from LA. She got up before 6 a.m. to be here with us. Nelia is an Indian-American photographer, a dancer, a storyteller. She started off, I love telling that, as a professional touring dancer with Madonna. She danced with Madonna and Cirque du Soleil. And she traveled all over. And at some point, she also picked up the camera as her way of expression, of expressing truth, of expressing humanity. And the last 2 years, she has been traveling to document COVID relief programs. She went to India and Brazil and her hometown of LA and Navajo Nation in the US. And she's here to share with us some of the stories, the humans that she met, the stories that stayed with her. So Nelia, please share with us what you saw through your lens.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm gonna get right into it. So in the very beginning of the pandemic, I was hired by 2 NGOs called World Central Kitchen and CORE to photograph their COVID relief operations in communities around the world who had the least amount of social protection and were hardest hit by the virus. So I have the unique privilege of bearing witness to the stories of people living in the world beside me that I otherwise never would have had access to. And today I want to share with you a little bit about what I learned from the world, from the way that they move in it. So we can go to the first photograph. These are farm workers harvesting radishes in Central California here in the US. They're all migrants from various countries in Latin America, and they send most of their earnings back home to their families. Many of them are undocumented, so they have no social protections at all, like healthcare or unemployment compensation, and getting COVID would have been disastrous for them and their families. And these were the early days of COVID when no one had any idea how the virus worked or how to protect ourselves from it. And one of the women I met said she was happy to talk to me, but please don't ask her about her family back home because she'd start crying and she wouldn't be able to stop. So everyone was scared, but while the rest of us were sheltering in place safely at home, these farm workers had no choice but to show up to work every day and provide for their families. And then after working in the field for 8 to 10 hours a day, they waited 2 hours in line in their cars to receive a free handout of dinner for their families. Many of the farm workers I spoke to told me they couldn't afford to buy groceries right now because their work hours had been cut back and they lived paycheck to paycheck. And the ones who were lucky enough to keep working found the grocery shelves were emptied out by the rest of us by the end of the day. So these were the people who were making it possible for us to keep food in our fridges while we sheltered in place, yet they weren't able to feed their own families. We can go to the next photograph. So these are tents on the sidewalk next to the highway in downtown Los Angeles. And they're home to about 6 people with no running water to wash their hands in a pandemic where that was the one thing we knew we could save our lives with. And the clinics where they usually went for basic needs had been shut down. So World Central Kitchen was providing packed lunches for them. Most of the unsheltered people I met in the tent encampments in downtown Los Angeles were people of color who had hit hard times and had been arrested for petty crimes. And now they couldn't find any work because of their criminal records, no matter how hard they tried. And they all shared their stories with me of their dreams and talents, but structural racism was shutting them out of access to the most basic opportunities, leaving them extremely vulnerable to catching the virus with no way to protect themselves. This gentleman here on the right with his dog, He told me how he mentors the younger men who live on the sidewalk nearby. And he said, with what little I have, I try to give back, even if it's just my knowledge. And the next picture, this woman told me that people always say she looks like the actress Halle Berry. And I wondered how different her life could have been had she been born into a different set of circumstances. We can move to the next. And the next, yeah. So here we are. I was sent to India during the deadly second wave when there were 200,000 new cases every day and 2,000 deaths being reported every day. And CORE was providing hygiene kits and vaccines to people living in the slums in Pune, a town 3 hours east of Mumbai. I personally lost multiple family members in India during this wave. So in preparing to go, I was bracing myself to be met with grief and heaviness and acute trauma. But instead, I was shocked to be met with joy and gratitude for life. And I was reminded of the power of the village, especially in times of crisis, and how big the definition of family is in Indian culture. And we don't even really have a word for cousin in my language. We just call each other brother and sister. And our parents' friends are our aunts and uncles, and everyone is family. And I saw the strength in how close-knit this community was and how they cared for each other. It was clear that everyone had each other's back. They live in very close proximity to each other, 3 to 4 generations living in single-room homes, all the neighbors knowing each other, helping each other figure out how to use pulse oximeters that we were donating to them, the kids using their cell phones to make vaccine appointments for the elders. There was no one here who was left to fend for themselves. And we can move forward now. Yeah, here we go. It was the same thing that struck me on the Navajo Nation, an indigenous reservation in the southwest of the US. On March 17th, 2020, COVID arrived on the reservation and spread like wildfire. In under a month, there were about 700 cases and 24 deaths, and it was targeting their elders, who were the ones that held the language, the ceremonies, and the ancient stories of the tribe. They were at risk of losing their entire culture. But why was COVID spreading 3 times faster on the Navajo Nation than in the rest of the country? The short answer is generations of systemic exclusion from resources and forced poverty. Our indigenous peoples have a much higher than average rate of underlying conditions like diabetes and heart disease because the US government cut them off from their traditional agricultural practices and got them addicted to flour, lard, sugar, and fast food. And here on the Navajo Nation, in an area about 70,000 square kilometers with 170,000 people living on it, there's only 13 grocery stores. 40% of the people are living under the federal poverty line, and typically 3 to 4 generations are living together in a single home, 35% of which of these homes don't have running water or electricity. So how are they going to socially distance and wash their hands? But being on their land forced me to slow down and learn how to listen more deeply. I learned that in Navajo culture, your family is considered your wealth. Their definition of family extended far beyond blood to clan relationship. And if someone was walking on the side of the road, they'd pull over and ask them what they needed, and no one was left stranded. At this point, the US government had barely taken any action to respond to COVID at all, but the Navajo were losing their elders, so their tribal government instated reservation-wide curfews, mask mandates, and lockdowns to slow down the spread. And no one I spoke to considered this a threat to their freedom. For them, it was an opportunity to do their part to protect grandma, so they happily complied. And it was the first thing they all mentioned to me, that every action they now took was to protect their elders, that their elders were the glue that held their families together and kept their culture alive. So everywhere I went, I was meeting people whose communities are left out from the world of the most basic needs. And I saw that what kept them going was the way they turned toward one another and cared for each other like family. And I would love to see that ethos extended to the human family at large. It became clear to me that collective care is what's going to get us through this turning point in human history, this idea that the well-being of each person is the responsibility of the group. And I believe that the first step of collective care is to slow down and really see the person in front of you, and to take in their story and feel all your feelings about it until you recognize yourself in them. And I think that if we all operated from that place, that we as a people would make very different policy decisions. So I thank you all for being here and for bringing your gifts together to create a more caring society.
Wow, I have goosebumps. Let's show her some love. Thank you, Nelia. That was beautiful. Not only the images, but also the words that you are putting in our systems actually to take forward. Thank you so much for so generously sharing your art. We also have it here on the walls, the photography that Nelia created. So much love and care to you.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Okay, so with that, how are we all feeling? Human? Yeah. Great. I would love to invite Professor Mansoub Murshid to the table as we go into our next topic around COVID-19 and inequality. And we have you here because this theme of inequality is definitely something that keeps coming back when speaking about all these impacts of COVID. And you are someone who can really enlighten us on the bigger picture and why are we living in such an unequal society. You're a professor of economics, the economics of peace and conflict at ISS. That's correct, right? Yes, and you're here maybe kind of for like a mini lecture to school us a bit. I want to first ask you, Mansoub, when it comes to inequality, what do you feel is an unseen face of this pandemic?
Well, I think it creates a lot of uncertainty. I mean, on impact, it's going to increase inequality, but are we at a crossroad? Are things going to change in terms of the trends that we've had for so long? I mean, we had very moving presentation on deprivation, but it's all based upon inequality. And I think in order to set the context, we have to think of the time that we live in.
Yeah.
An English romantic poet called William Wordsworth spoke of the French Revolution, and he was 19 at that time, and he said, "Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, and to be young was very heaven." And of course, I'm not young, and I'm glad I'm not young, because we do not live in such times. But
great, Mansoub. Thanks a lot.
But basically, what we have at the moment is we have a reversal of a process which took place for most of the 20th century, which has been occurring since roughly 1980. So the period from the First World War to the 1970s was a period, broadly speaking, and there might be some disagreement, of declining inequality and of periods of growth with increasing prosperity, but with redistribution. So the kind of huge inequalities which prevailed in the world prior to the First World War diminished. And since 1980, we've seen them coming back with a vengeance. So that's why I'm saying that, our economic system, let's just use one word, capitalism, and, our political system, or the political system we aspire to, which we can broadly call democracy, are no longer, compatible with this high degree of inequality. So that's the first point.
You actually summarize it for us in a sentence. Can we maybe see it? And please take this in, because there are some words in there that I had to Google several times. So capitalism and democracy become strange bedfellows if there's too much plutocracy.
Well, with apologies to Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, the last sentence of it, this is government for the rich, by the rich, and of the rich.
Plutocracy means government for the rich, by the rich, and of the rich. Okay.
Not the people, but the affluent. So essentially what we are seeing is that in the last 40 years, our systems of governance, the systems of policy making have become something which is driven entirely by the interests of the rich or the large corporations, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. And that's been driving the rise in inequality. So essentially the earlier redistributive social contracts that we had, even if they were not particularly radical, but at least they provided social protection, equal access to education, and equal access to education is very important in lowering inequality in the long run.
Yeah.
We've seen a rolling back of that, and we see legislation, policy it's driven by the interests of the corporation. And therefore, we've also seen this anti-globalization backlash.
Right. Okay. So you're saying that because of the plutocracy, this combination of capitalism and democracy actually creates a lot of inequality.
No, this combination is becoming incompatible.
Incompatible.
Yeah.
Right. And can you maybe say something, because I know this is on everybody's minds here in the room probably, about how this is maybe linked, especially this plutocracy, to the war between, with Russia and the Ukraine, the situation that's kind of sprung upon us. How is this linked to it?
Plutocracy, can lead to wars, but we're dealing with a society in the aggressor country where it is extremely plutocratic as well.
Yeah.
So, and that is based upon a different form of plutocracy in the sense it's based upon essentially grabbing natural resource rents. So when you have hydrocarbons, it's possible for a small group of individuals to grab the profits from that, and that creates a hugely rich people who are referred to as oligarchs.
Yeah.
There was a different word beginning with an S referring to the same group in the 1970s. Yeah. I'm old enough to remember.
You don't want to mention the S word?
The second letter is H, shakes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, and you had a little explainer sentence coming after this, which says, plutocratic tendencies have been on the rise since the era of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan.
Actually,
can you very briefly explain why
it will
this is
take
important?
2 seconds. That's exactly what I said. Using these two proper names to define the beginning of a historical age where we see the reversal of the equalizing, leveling phase of history, which probably occurred for about 65 years from 1914 onwards.
Okay.
And I think the interesting point is the next slide.
The next slide is the interesting point. Okay, so the third and last point that you were going to make, can we see the third sentence? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Will the pandemic halt this process, actually, what we're seeing of increased inequality?
Okay, so what...
you explain it, how you meant it.
So basically what happens is in our colleagues in history, in economic history, tell us that, the processes of leveling, of equalizing, differences in opportunities, income, and so on, to create a more egalitarian society. These processes can be either a kind of aspirin palliative effect, so it's a little by little by little, in the longer run, or these big changes which bring about more equal societies or more egalitarian societies. In history, they occur when they are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I quote that from Scheidel. And 2 of these processes are pandemics and wars.
Can you say I read the chapter?
Yeah, extreme war, pandemics, state collapse, and revolution. Okay, so if a pandemic is has a very high mortality effect, it usually leads to an egalitarian outcome in terms of income, wealth, and other things. We saw that with the so-called Magna Pestilentia, the Black Death of the 14th century. Okay, even the 30 years war in Germany reduced inequality.
Right.
But
now
certainly
in our plutocratic society of
let's
today?
wait and see. So I don't, let's wait and see.
Yeah.
This might be a crossroad, but the initial impact is greater inequality.
Greater inequality.
Yeah, but that's initial. Whether there is a more long-term change, and we do see some movements in that direction. People are more conscious of what has happened because of the pandemic. Yeah. People are more conscious of the inequality. So possibly there is some hope that, people are more aware of plutocratic tendencies and are more prepared to fight it. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And we have someone here actually who is fighting it in her own way. Uttara, are you here with us? Yes, hi. Uttara Narayanan, I hope I say it correctly, calling in, yes, great, from India. You're in Bangalore, right?
Yes.
Right now. I can't hear you yet. Maybe that's...
No.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, great, welcome. And Uttara is the chief change... Of course, of course. You're the chief change maker at Buzz Women. And this is a school on wheels, actually, that helps women develop their entrepreneurship, their confidence to break out of the spiral and poverty. And why it's so interesting to have you here is you described your work as a democratizer and an equalizer. So exactly the antidote to what Mansoub here is describing. So I just want to ask you, what can we learn from your work about democratizing and equalizing things in this highly unequal society?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think there's a bit of a lag from when I speak and when you're able to hear it. So pardon me if I'm ending up cutting you somewhere. Thank you for having me. Yes, what we are giving women in rural areas who are right now suffering or who have been affected by inequality is an opportunity. That's the way we put it. So democratizing knowledge, democratizing the access to opportunities is what we provide. And of course, we do that in 5 different aspects of life. We call it cash, confidence, community, climate, and care. It is really nice to hear all the speakers before this talk about all the ways in which COVID has impacted. But I feel it is not just COVID, it has always been around. And in India, at least, I'm actually seeing that COVID has, in some aspects, deepened it more, but in some aspect, it has also remedied it in a lot of ways because of certain the way that digitization is now happening, the way that digital has been taken up by a lot of people who didn't have access to it because they were forced to do it because of the pandemic. So I think that there has been a good and bad side to it. I'm a believer that, like culturally in India, we always believe that there is always good and evil around, good and bad around. The proportion varies, and that's when we have these disequilibriums, and then it comes back to the equilibrium. So what are we tackling in Buzz Women? Is one, the lack of knowledge. And I can also connect that to the idea of, even during the COVID, of the myths that were around, not having really access to information, which was critical for people to understand what does this pandemic mean, how am I supposed to deal with it. The digital divide that is there in a very deep way. Only 35% of the women that we go to have an access to a smartphone. Women still, a lot of them use feature phones, and some of them don't even have access to those phones. So in India, they keep saying that there are 1 billion cell phone numbers being used. It's because the rich have more than one number, or there are corporates which have more than one number. It's not that every person has it.
Yeah, and we see
also the lack of.
Yeah, I just want to say, we see here one of the buses that you go around with. So you take the bus to the women in the villages, and there they get the education, the cash, the confidence, the community, the care, the entrepreneurship training. Can you maybe share?
It is about the last mile, going to the doorstep of these women, because again, the access to the opportunity is that women they cannot come out of their households too often because of farm, animals, taking care of the children, the family, everything falls on them, the responsibilities. So what we believe is that we have to go to their doorstep if they have to access these opportunities. And that's why we believe that that's how we are tackling inequality, by bringing it to them rather than expecting them to come out of their villages.
Yeah, exactly. And here we see of some of the women that you work with there. And
it's like a foldable tent that we have, put it under a tree. We carry all the equipment required for these sessions that we have with women. Even getting them out of their households and having conversations with them is in itself an opportunity, because they find it quite exciting that somebody wants to talk to them, somebody wants to give them the knowledge, skills, and tools that is required for them to bring themselves out of poverty. And when I say poverty and inequality, I don't just mean in terms of cash or economics, but it also means the social poverty, the time poverty. There is so much more to the word poverty. We believe that it's because that their capabilities have not been tapped, their potential has not been tapped, which is what we do. For them to realize, so we call it self-shakti. Shakti in India means strength or power within. And we believe that women have to tap into their own power to bring themselves out. And for that, they need the exposure and the knowledge, the skills and tools, which is what we are bringing to them.
Yeah, exactly. And the equalizing effect you're saying is the exposure to opportunities and what could be. And the pandemic has both been helpful in that because of the digitalization, the further digitalization that's been taken up, and also, negative. But there's resilience that you've built in these women to also get this curveball. They can
because of the lockdowns of the pandemic, there was lack of privacy. Women were not able to come out. They were having to take care of more family members who had migrated back into the villages.
Right.
Lack of work. So there is, of course, a lot more that the women are dealing with, but also what we are trying to build is the resilience, like you rightly said. It is about women looking at their challenges to see how can I overcome this, because rather than getting bogged down by it. And that's where the building of the self-worth and the confidence comes in.
Yeah.
Because women have money, and we have seen it, at least in India, that just because women have money in their hands doesn't mean they have more freedom or independence.
Yeah, exactly.
It is about also believing in themselves,
exactly,
which is what we are trying to instill
self-shakti. That's a word. Thank you, Uttara, for enlightening us with like a way to deal with this inequality, because it's a given in our system. And how do we fight it? There's multiple ways. You're showing us one. We have a question from the audience, and it's directed to you, Mansoub. And the question is, what are the mechanics of pandemics that drive increasing equality in the past? Do you think the conditions are different today? Do you understand the question?
Yes, I do. The question.
Do we all understand the question?
The question is that in the past, it lowered the supply of labor, and it increased the real wages of people who survived the pandemic. So, for example, in the 14th century with the Black Death, it is estimated half of England's population was died. So the agricultural laborers who survived the pandemic experienced a sharp rise in their wages. Not only that, it also was the beginning of the end of something. And what was that? Feudalism. Not everywhere, however, not in Italy. Italy, the landowners brutally suppressed peasants. In England, in Belgium, and even in Germany 2 centuries later, there were peasant revolts. Revolts did not succeed. I mean, the English peasant rebellion, the slogan was, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" But it didn't succeed, but wages did increase. Nowadays, there are labor-saving technical progress which is taking place. However, there are studies which suggest that the great demographic surge, which was created in the 1980s by the entry of China and latterly India into the world globalization trading system, which meant that their workforce became part of the global workforce. And then Eastern Europe, after the fall of the, of the socialist system, that trend has been reversed. And for the first time, we are seeing a decrease in labor supply, albeit very small.
Right, right.
So, but however, labor can be substituted.
Globalization is a very different factor here.
No. It's not just globalization. Mm-hmm. There are signs that globalization has slightly been disrupted by the disruption in the global value chains because of China's zero COVID tolerance policy. But the point over here, which the questioner made to me, was in the past it was more difficult to substitute labor.
Right, yeah.
Now it is more easy to do that. But still, we are seeing, a decline in labor supply in the world, post-pandemic.
Right.
So it will be interesting to see the outcome. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. But it does make a difference, I gather, that we are now a global labor
That's actually
market.
laid out in the chapter. In the
Read
book.
the book is the answer.
No, that's not the answer. That's a lame answer.
I'll take it. All right. If anyone else has questions, you can use the Menti code again. I'll repeat it. So menti.com, and then you go to you use the code 7767-9309. Mansoor, we ran out of time here for this topic, but
now
please,
for other people.
You don't have to rush away. I want to introduce our next block. We're going to travel to a new theme, a new continent. We're going to speak about COVID-19 and education. And to get a feel.
Observa la lámina de mi álbum de preescolar, segundo.
Just to introduce the fragment, to get a feel of the situation in Latin America, there's this very short 2-minute fragment from France 24, and it shows us Mexico. And the interesting thing is you see teachers teaching via television, an education minister who thinks that's fantastic, and then a child who shows you the reality of it for her.
Observa la lámina de mi álbum de preescolar, segundo grado, página 16.
For the last 6 months, Zohar and Carla have been teaching an entire country on TV.
Ahí está, ¿no?
Esperamos pronto vernos en los salones de clase.
¡Ay, sí! Hasta la
Mexican schools have remained closed to try and curb the pandemic. No one knows when they might reopen. Carla herself is a teacher in a modest Mexico City neighborhood. She is worried about her pupils.
Tratamos de que todos tengan acceso en cuanto al contenido de lo que hacemos. Existen variedad de medios en donde pueden encontrar estos programas en internet, en la televisión, en el radio. Estamos muy preocupadas por nuestros niños que no tienen acceso a ninguna de estas nuevas estrategias que se están tomando, y sí estamos preocupadas por ellos porque pues no sabemos en lo que están viviendo en casa.
These strategies were initially designed as an emergency response, but according to the education minister, they could stay even after the pandemic is over.
Muchas de las cosas que ustedes van a hacer para iniciar el ciclo escolar es la educación del futuro. La forma en que se relacionen con sus alumnas y alumnos a distancia.
A third of Mexican children have no idea what this future looks like. Amatitlan, one of many remote villages in rural Mexico. Here, everyone works in the fields. There is little or no phone coverage, let alone internet. Lucy is 7. She spends most of her time caring after her brother or playing with her cousins.
Extraño mi salón, extraño la sillé, extraño mis maestros. Ya quiero tener clases para enseñarme a leer. Solamente que me enseñan mis papás a leer, pero no puedo.
The TV subscription is €10 a month. Lucy's parents buy it when they can, but then the electricity goes out.
Yeah, and what do you do then? Okay, well, we're here with someone who is on research on this topic, Georgina Gomez. Welcome to the table.
Thank you.
You're an associate professor at ISS, and your research covers quite a lot of ground, several aspects of socioeconomic life, local governance. What I find interesting is from an evolutionary and institutional perspective. And you wrote this chapter together with someone called Andrés Usin. We see him here.
Correct.
Yeah. So Andres, if you're watching, thank you for enlightening us in advance.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Georgina, I want to ask you, because when we were preparing, you said to me that 2 decades, so 20 years of progress was basically undone on the continent in Latin America. The education systems were at quite a high level, but the pandemic kind of destroyed the entire thing. Can you share a few facts and figures just to sketch out what's happening on the continent?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. I wouldn't say high level, but they were expanding, and especially primary school education was slowly reaching everybody. And another colleague at ISS, Blas Renaud, he says, well, the debate was shifting from quantity, from numbers covering everybody, to an issue of quality and secondary school and how to make secondary school graduates more employable. So you saw that the discourses around education in Latin America were moving away. And all of a sudden, this pandemic came, and yeah, schools were closed. And we went back. We went back to the basics of how to get children, like the one you showed in the video, basic things, reading, writing, counting. Mm-hmm. So indeed, this pushes back the whole continent substantially. Also, in terms of spending, you saw a slow but consistent increase in spending in education, and also the sophistication into digital education, etc. And all of that stopped. All of that stopped, and then the question was, again, how to reach these children in remote communities to read and write.
Yeah.
And it made more evident that it simply cannot be done. There was this wall, the digital divide, which showed very clearly that some children could more or less learn things, basic things. The parents could help. They had access to Google immediately. They could manage. Mm-hmm. Yeah? But then you had the vast majority of poorer children who had no access, or that they were in families where their parents couldn't help, or, well, given the impossibility of going out to work, children also had to go back to work to help, to raise an income, to find ways of getting simple things like food and shelter. So it was a very complicated process at schools that were closed, but also for children. How do we manage? How do we pay for to get access for the ones that were at least covered by internet? And this issue of getting access is, well, maybe there is only one smartphone in the family, and there were all these WhatsApp groups of parents, one per child, sending materials, please cover this chapter for tomorrow. And there was one mobile phone for 6 children. So basically it didn't work.
Yeah.
And now it's the moment to catch up.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully.
And you also shared this kind of little bit heartbreaking example of parents also having to choose between children. Or
Sure, because if you have one mobile phone or one laptop and 2 hours of minutes to connect, you need to choose who are you going to give access. Access, I mean technology, mm-hmm. to. So is it the one that is most clever? Is it the one that is older? Do you educate the girls? And in some places, educating the girls is less important than educating the boys, but the boys can work. And there were all these discussions about, who is more valuable? Which one of the children in the family should have access? And which one do we leave behind until the pandemic ends?
Yeah, exactly.
But it
schools
lasted
were
long.
closed for a very long time on the continent.
Yeah, up to 2 years.
2 years of school closures. Exactly. In Mexico, I also read it was 14 months of this. Yeah. And you have some photos with you, actually, to show us kind of, because it's not just the children and the schools, it's also what happens to a whole community when a school is not there. So can you share why this photo is here?
This is Bolivia. This is the outskirts of Santa Cruz. Actually, when the school was set up in this area, it was rural, but now Santa Cruz has grown and engulfed this area as well. And because this school was there before the rest of the neighborhood was there, it's the heart of the community. So everything that happens in this area happens through the school. So when there was, I don't know, petition government to rebuild a bridge, it was organized from the school. When we have to go and ask bus companies to come to this area, it was organized through the school. Vaccination campaigns, whatever you can think of, it happens in the schools, through the schools. And what you see here is, well, nothing happening. It's an empty street.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of community organization. This meeting point was not meeting all of a sudden. And I think this is one of the interesting phases of the hidden phases of the pandemic, is that the communities have stopped getting together because the place where they used to get together were closed.
Is closed, exactly.
So it's the heart of the community. All of a sudden, the heart wasn't there.
Yeah, exactly. We have some more photos. Yeah.
This was, sorry?
Another thing that's not happening.
Yeah, one
of
the reasons that in many schools in Latin America persuades parents to send their children to school every day is that they get food. They get a warm meal at school every day. And when schools closed, well, the children didn't have access for, as I said, almost 2 years in some places, to this meal, to a relatively balanced meal, always with local products, but nevertheless, it was sometimes better than what their parents could afford at home.
Yeah.
So it's also children not getting to read and write, but also children not getting their meal.
Their meal. We have another one. Yeah.
Well, and this is the other aspect, that this is also Bolivia. In some places where there's a lot of violence in communities due to gang violence or drug-related, the schools are very often the safe havens, the sanctuaries, where the stabbing stays outside the school, where rivalry between families stays outside the school, and the school is the safe place. And the safe place, the place where we could all feel safe, was closed. So again, this all speaks about various aspects of disintegration of communities, that, as I say, now I'm hopeful that it will come back.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Even gang violence is in the mix here.
Well, that hasn't stopped.
That hasn't stopped, exactly.
Yeah.
The last one that you brought.
Well, this is also a rural area in which the parents got together to demand asphalt, to demand pavement, because each time it rains, this became, well, impossible to get the children to get to school. And these were all ways in which poor communities were demanding their governments to do their jobs. And, well, that stopped as well. The governments don't have these constant pressure to do what they should do. So probably politicians said, well, we can do something else for a while.
Yeah, this is so interesting indeed. All the aspects that you don't think about when a school closes. And you also have a song, actually, that tells a story. But maybe we have a little surprise for you here. The song is called Caminando, and we actually have someone here in the room that can sing. And it's my dad.
Oh, as long as you don't ask me to sing.
Yeah, I'm going to actually ask all of us to sing it, just to like get into it. Yeah, one of the things that made me so proud of my dad is his voice. It's the most beautiful voice that I know. And he's here to sing this song with us. Are you guys ready? Yes? Okay, great.
Caminando, caminando.
Can we do that together? Caminando. Let's do it. Caminando. You can sing louder than that.
E nunca paré, entre risa e dolore, caminando, pa'lante con fe, caminando, caminando, caminando,
caminando. Let me hear you. Caminando. Yeah,
tropezones,
caminando
y nunca paré,
caminando
entre risa y dolores,
caminando
pa'lante con fe,
caminando.
caminando.
Yeah, well done.
Nice.
Well done. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. I see the smiles on everybody's faces. So this song, you can see the translation here. Walking, walking, walking. That's what we were singing, right? Caminando. Can you explain to us why this song is touching you?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Well, this chapter we wrote it at the end of a project in 6 Latin American countries. And in the Dominican Republic, when we were doing the field work in one of the rural schools, a sugar producing area that you can do kilometers and kilometers, and the only thing you would see is sugarcane, and the school. And we gave a ride to one of the teachers, and he told us that he had been a student when he was a child, and his parents, they were also cutting sugarcane, extreme poverty. And he said he walked 4 hours, 2 and 2, to go back home, to go to school. So 4 hours of every day of his life were spent on walking to school. And they played this song on the radio, and he said, oh, this has a meaning to me. And I realized how important it is for so many children in Latin America that they walk 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to go to school, to learn to read and write. The strength of the faith they must have that school is going to get them a better life.
Exactly. Caminando towards a better life.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Jim. I have a question to you, Georgina, from the audience. Was there any emergency initiatives from the government targeting poor families in this situation?
There were several. They varied by country.
Okay.
So in some countries they were given usually, almost invariably insufficient. Small subsidies and especially in the first wave, in the beginning of the pandemic, and afterwards they kind of were reduced gradually or all of a sudden. They got a bit of money, sometimes rarely in kind, most of the time in cash transfers. And then they simply stopped. But there were all sorts of difficulties in reaching the subsidy. So you had to meet certain conditions, you had to go to a certain place, and you had to fill in forms digitally, which, again, it traps us in the digital divide. So there were several. And as I said, insufficient most of the time, but better than nothing. But they in themselves created the inequalities of who could access these subsidies, these cash transfers.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. We've reached the end of this part of the conversation. It was very enlightening. Thank you for that, Georgina. I do want to show you some appreciation as well for your work and for this awareness. So we're going into our third and last theme. It's going really fast, right? The last part is about climate and water. And we will start again with a little fragment, this time from Zimbabwe, Harare, the capital city. And this gives a face to what Eliseus was sharing earlier about only 20% of people in low-income countries actually having access to hand-washing facilities in this time.
Dambudziko iri rakatanga muna 2013 ndopatakatanga kungoshaya mvura patepa ibude ende kwatinenge tichibva kwacho kure tinofamba 5 kilometers 6 kilometers kuti tisvike kunoku tione mvura.
We were here in Harare shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic to continue an investigation on a severe sanitation and water crisis. Thousands of residents across Harare have no access to clean water.
We are losing a lot of treated water along the system because the pipeline is aged. Around a third of our people are only accessing water and 2/3 are not. And that's a dangerous situation.
Women and children of school-going age spend sometimes 8, 9 hours and all night at the borehole, queuing for water.
Kana kuti dzimwe nguva toshaya nguva yekunyatsowerenga nekuti kuchibhorani zvafanira kuti manheru kuma10 unongoda unobata line saka wazokwanisa nguva yekunyatsowerenga pa kumafoni unongochimukira uchiuya futi kunoko.
This problem has gone on long enough, but COVID-19 has made an already dire situation even more urgent.
Exactly. So we're back here with Eliseos and your colleague and friend, I believe, Matthias Rieger, also associate professor at ISS. Welcome, Matthias.
Thank you, Lynn.
And we also have joining us from the African continent, from Kenya, Doris Ago. Hi, Doris.
Hi. It's a bit dark here now, but I hope you can see me.
Yeah, we can definitely still see you. I hope we can still see that she has very cool pink hair.
Crazy.
And Doris, you are a consultant and researcher around climate and water and many issues that are interlinked to that around gender, etc. And you've collaborated with Eliseos as well in recent years. So thank you so much for joining us. This is actually our third continent calling in. It's very, very special. All right, so I want to ask you, Matthias, because you also contributed to the book, the chapter around water, and you very much focused on this aspect of child stunting, the relationship between water and sanitation and children stunting, and specifically open defecation, no hand washing, etc., what you see on this slide. But can you explain to us in one sentence, maybe for people who don't know, what is child stunting and why has this topic grabbed your attention so much?
Yeah, sure. So let's all think back to the beginning of the pandemic. What do? We all started washing our hands obsessively, buying hand sanitizers and piling up stocks of toilet paper. And at the time I was thinking, well, that's easy for us to do. But in many parts of low-income countries, people do not have access to safe drinking water, safe ways to wash their hands, and safe sanitation. And, that's a big problem because even, before the pandemic, we know that there's a very strong link between unsafe wash conditions, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene, and child stunting. What's child stunting and why is it bad? Well, that's when children are too short for their age. So when they're under the age of 5, they get born and then their growth collapses and they're not reaching their anthropometric potential, their height potential. And that's going to have long-term consequences on them in terms of their well-being when they're adults, on their health when they're adults, but also the economic productivity. There's strong evidence that they will have lower wages, for instance, and have also lower education outcomes. And so that really echoed with me during the beginning, especially of the pandemic. And it also shows that something that's not usually on our mind, wash, water, sanitation, hygiene, that suddenly becomes on our mind is even important outside of the pandemic, before the pandemic, and something we need to invest more. And, to be fair, there have been big improvements over the last decades in sanitation and water access in many countries, but we have to do much more than that.
Yeah.
There's still about 150 million children as we speak, are too short for the age, under 5 years of age. Yeah.
So it's also kind of a positive aspect that we're focusing more now on water and sanitation.
Yeah.
It might have positive effects or outcomes for the children.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Let's look at the other relationships that are in this chapter very eloquently described. Eliseos, we have some more relationships here now, but I thought it was extremely fascinating how this all ties together. The link between, the pressure on water, the climate crisis, food security, and this pandemic. Can you enlighten us on what's important to understand about this?
Thanks, Lynn, for the introduction. I have to say, Matthias had an easier picture to describe. In this one, you can see the arrows pointing in all directions.
Very unequal.
Which also, of course, shows how complex these interrelationships are. I think what's important to get out of this picture is that, although it might not be immediately visible, at least at first sight, climate change, water security, and this pandemic and future pandemics are actually interlinked, they're interrelated. They're all anthropogenically induced, mediated,
you
amplified.
Mean caused by humans?
Exactly, so they relate to human activities. And this, when I talk about human activities, this is of course about population growth, it's about increased and often ill-planned urbanization in many parts of the world. It's about deforestation. It's about inadequate infrastructure. It's about frugality in public investment. That is, governments are not spending enough on education, on green transformation, new technologies, and so on. And all these human activities, of course, increase our contact with other species. They increase the spread of pathogens. But they're also responsible for global warming and water scarcity. And you can also see at this slide, trade specialization and trade liberalization also is a large part of their story. We often think of trade specialization and globalization. We often think of the more positive aspects of it. I mean, many of the things that we consume, right, come from other countries. Things have become cheaper. There's a wider variety of consumer goods that we are consuming, but there are also many negative side effects. So, for example, in many parts of the world, there has been specialization in water-intensive commodities. Like think of the floriculture industry in Ethiopia and Kenya.
Yeah.
And as a result of this, of course, there has been a gradual depletion of aquifers, of water tables.
Flowers means less water.
Flowers need a lot of water.
Yeah, exactly.
And it also means that there is less room for conventional farming.
Yeah.
So it's good sometimes to specialize in terms of the commodities that you're trading, but it also means that this comes at the expense of domestic production that was being carried out earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically you substitute your own domestic food with cheaper imported food.
Yeah.
And under normal circumstances, that doesn't pose a risk to food security.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, these are not normal circumstances. When you have a pandemic that creates disruption to trade and the agricultural supply chains, then the risks emerge.
Yeah, exactly.
And that creates, of course, problems for food security.
Yeah. So if I summarize this very briefly, there's a lot of pressure on water in many places of the world because of how we manage it, expanding populations, etc. It becomes worse because of climate change, and it leads us to also be able to, we can grow less food because of it. And then we have to import food from other countries. And then if there's a pandemic or a war like now, that becomes a very risky situation. Thank you for explaining that, Eliseus. Doris, I would like to ask you, because you work a lot in communities in Kenya, different themes, and beyond Kenya as well, actually. But how do you see these links play out in Kenya? What's important for us to see, the links between the pandemic, water, climate, and just people's lives?
Thank you, Lane. Just to go back to say that, Eliseus, well done for your book. And just to say that if I had to write your book, I think I'll go the other way around. I'll say that there were invisible faces and of COVID millionaires in Kenya, for example, and I'm sure it was also all over the world. So the first time we were illuminating and highlighting the people who are vulnerable and risky people. But at the same time, there were invisible faces that we couldn't see because there were all sorts of irregularities in terms of bids and tenders, in terms of face masks and all that. So I think it was really interesting in that respect. So yeah, that's what COVID did. But just to say in Kenya, I think there's some good news in Kenya in terms of wash and water. So the government commissioned some boreholes. So for the first time, some communities who hadn't had water for a long time were able to get water because I think nearly 200 boreholes were dug in Nairobi and other informal settlements in the surrounding areas in Nairobi. So it was really a big plus. And it showed that water was really important. Wash was very important, and for the government as well. But just to go to the linkages and linking the dots between COVID and climate. So I was very lucky to do some work in the rural areas as well as in urban areas during COVID, well, just after COVID. And so one of the things was the prolonged drought which really affected like smallholder farmers. And the majority are women in the rural areas. So you can imagine these women, they were relying on water for their crop production because they cannot afford irrigation. So that really affected them. So in terms of women. And then in the informal settlements in Nairobi, we're talking of gender as well. The fact that the markets were closed and transportation was really hard. And there's a lot of water vendors. The majority are the young people and young men who often go to these markets to provide water for people, the people who are in the markets. So you can imagine they lost businesses as well. So there was a direct link there to the COVID, the closure of markets, and they couldn't provide water as well because there was no business. And then the other one is the impact that the pandemic has on the community in general. So there was a big divide between the rural and the urban areas. And I was very lucky to do some work with ILO, the International Labour Organizations, how the COVID really influenced between rural and urban areas. So in fact, in terms of infrastructure, like in the informal settlement, the infrastructure was very poor. So the rural areas, even though climate was affecting, there's prolonged drought, they could actually still get water because of, it's free in the rural areas, although they still spend a lot of time searching for water. But imagine in the urban areas where, businesses were really bad, they couldn't get access to water. So it's really a huge divide between the rural and urban areas. So I just stop there.
Thank you for bringing those aspects in. Indeed, the gender aspect that we haven't touched upon enough maybe is very relevant. The urban-rural divide, I think that's very relevant points to make. Eliseus, because Doris is also saying like the link between the pandemic and climate. We've been speaking about water climate relates to water, but you also looked up something interesting, and that is how much we spend on the pandemic or the consequences of COVID versus how much we spend on mitigating or adapting to climate. Can you say something about that, please?
Yes. So, I mean, from these figures, you can see that there is a fundamental difference regarding how much we spend. I mean, within a very short period of time, but governments around the world and international organizations managed to raise $8 trillion US dollars, right, for mitigating the effects of COVID-19, as well as mitigating the spread of the virus. Now, if you compare this with how much we spent on climate change mitigation and adaptation, that's basically only 1/10 of these values, 800 billion US dollars. So it's quite a striking difference. How for one problem we can very quickly raise a lot of funds, but for another issue that many will say it's of equal importance, actually we only spend 1/10.
Yeah.
And that says something about our perceptions on urgency of different issues.
Exactly. It is interesting. In a book, you guys also mention public bad. We're always speaking about public goods, but these are two public bads, right? The pandemic and climate, and the consequences of the climate crisis might be 10 times larger, actually, but we spend 10 times less on it. Do any of you have any idea? Before I ask my question, I want to remind you that there's a Mentimeter that you can also ask questions, and not just me. If there's any last questions, you can go to menti.com, use the code 776-79309. Yeah, thanks. 776-79309, menti.com. You can ask any last burning questions that you have. Back to my question. How is it possible? Do you have any ideas on how we could learn from how we've handled the pandemic and spend more on urgent issues like water management, climate, make the urgency of that more felt, maybe?
Yeah, maybe a small thing from my point of view. I do a lot of work in behavioral research. And what we see here is when the problems are very salient, you feel them, you're more likely to do something about it. And we've been all subjected to big experiments, governments nudging us to wear masks, nudging us to wash our hands. And I think a lot of these studies that have been done around the world now in behavioral research might help us to get people also to care more about climate change and do the right thing when it comes to recycling and comes to saving energy and so forth.
Do you have any tips for the government on how to move the herd?
Well, we know much better now how to move people, and one thing I think works well is this kind of peer pressure.
Right.
So I've been washing more my hands because everyone around me is doing it. So kind of leveraging these peer effects was one thing that's very strong.
Yeah.
And that's also true for pro-environmental behavior.
Right. Peer pressure. But how do you create peer pressure?
Let's see. I don't know. I don't have all solutions.
You're a behavioral economist, right?
Well, there's some tricks, but it's not straightforward.
You're not going to. It's only for the behavioral economists to know. Yeah. All right. Any other questions from you? This is your last chance to ask. Don't be shy. Well, we have the drinks here to ask your questions. Any last questions? Because if not, we will go to our last guest from our fourth continent. She's not very far away because I think she's calling in from The Hague. And, this book and this entire event is meant to build bridges between the research that's being done in an institute like ISS with great critical thinkers and I don't know, just like things we need to all know to inform our practice and policy as well. So we're very honored to be able to hand over the first copy of this book as we're launching it today, right now, to Pascale Grotenhuis. Pascale is the Director of Social Development and Ambassador for Women's Rights and Gender Equality at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in the Netherlands. And we get to give her the first copy. She has it. Yeah, we could do a little trick. Great. Welcome, Pascale.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Very honored to have you join. And I'll let you actually virtually hand it over to her. You can see how you...
Pascale, now you have two copies, of course, in effect.
Yeah.
So, very honored to have you here. Of course, you're also in a way an international development person, but from another perspective, not necessarily as a researcher, but more from the side of policy making. So without, of course, wanting to put you on the spotlight, the question that we would all be eager to hear back from you is about what kind of co-synergies you can think that we can create as researchers, policymakers, practitioners, other stakeholders, in terms of solving problems of such global dimension, such as climate change or the pandemic. I know it's a very difficult question.
Yeah. How can the researchers and the policymakers and other stakeholders come together better around this?
And maybe as a follow-up question is whether you think the pandemic has made it more difficult for all of us to come together and find solutions to these problems. Or maybe it has even made it easier, right, through digital technologies.
I think the first question is quite big, and thank you so much for having me. And I've been listening to all the previous speakers actually from the beginning. And it struck me that we're working in completely the same field, right? I mean, we have our embassies and our programs and the NGOs and the private sector also telling these stories. And I've been in this job now for 18 months, starting in COVID. And it changed the realities. And I think there were many facts mentioned already. And what I didn't hear it yet. But if you look at gender equality, for instance, before COVID, it would take 96 years to achieve gender parity in the world. And now, and we're not at the end of COVID, even though in the Netherlands we're not using a mask anymore, but it's just, but now it will take 136 years. And probably in a few years, when we really feel all the consequences of COVID on the budget of the health minister in Mozambique or in Burkina, on the money allocation or the resource allocation that's going into COVID instead of climate, I think the negative effects we will only feel in the years to come because it's not over yet. And already we see that we're so backtracking on achieving the SDGs, we will never make it in 2030. And I'm a really big optimist. So I think it's just terrifying actually to speak about this. But it also signals that we need to do more and we need to do it together. I think that's the good thing about COVID. And I think it was mentioned already, there's quite some valuable lessons from the COVID pandemic that you can achieve change, that you can achieve that everybody's going to wash their hands, that you can achieve that people are using masks, that you can achieve resource mobilization when it's needed. So I think trying to be the optimist that I am, I also see a few silver linings in how we dealt with the crisis, even though it's never perfect. And I think we can talk for hours about the things that we did not do well. But there are some things that we did do well, and I think the urgency for doing it together, I think that's very clear. And also, I think I've been working in development for the last more than 20 years, I have to say, but also for people not working in development, I think it's extremely clear. Sorry about
you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, my son is calling. That's the thing about working hybridly. No, I think
her son took over.
How interconnected the world is. So actually, so if something, there's a new strain in South Africa, it affects the Netherlands. If there's a new strain in Denmark, it will affect the rest of the world. So I think we don't have to make the pitch anymore that it's a one interconnected world and we have interconnected problems. So, and then coming to your first question on how can we use your research on also on the policy and how can we make this a standard way of working? I think it's easier to find each other because of COVID, because of online working, because everybody's so used and so skilled now in online working. It's actually easier for me to reach out to people in the rest of the world without having to take a plane or other people having to take a plane. So I think it is easier. And I think the urgency is also very much clear that we need all the different perspectives, not only the policymaker, not only the researchers, but also the banks, the finance people, the NGOs. Because what you also see is because of COVID, you see actually a pushback against liberties of NGOs, of people, of gender equality. So we also have to push back against the pushback, as I always say. It's English really awful. But it's really needed. And we need all the players. We cannot exclude anyone because COVID, but also climate affects us all and affects in particular vulnerable people.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
a long answer to a complicated question.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could spend a whole new episode on answering this question for sure. But we're so happy that you have the book in your hands, Pascal, and we hope that also the insights shared today help us to prioritize and to come together around the issues that are outside of our sight sometimes. And indeed, if we come together, we can see more the 360 of the state of our world. So thank you so much, Pascal, for joining us here.
Well, thank you for inviting us. And it's really a pleasure to have listened to all the previous speakers and to find so many similarities in the work that we do. And I didn't read it yet because I just got the copy, but I will definitely get back to you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, we've come to the end of this day together. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, everyone tuning in from 34 countries. Our lovely speakers, Nelia, Uttara, Doris, Pascal, calling in from the 4 continents, really bringing us together here. We've seen a lot of unseen faces, I would say. Do you agree? Yeah, we've spoken about the poverty rising by 150 million to close to 1 billion people living in extreme poverty now. Nelia showed us what's happening, for instance, the unsheltered population, the Navajo Nation, a huge piece of land in the US where there's no water and electricity and where the elders are being protected, actually. we've spoken about the plutocracy and how it has made capitalism and democracy actually not a good compatible combination anymore, and that we are awakening to that fact. And as we stand up to that, and we don't want to live in a world that's only good for wealthy people, that might be the tipping point, actually. And the initiative that Uttara shared of exposing everyone to the opportunities that we all should have is important in that. We saw education was so beautiful to see indeed like what it means if a school is not there for a community, for a family, for a country. Yeah, that we maybe the unseen value of the school, actually, that we should cherish, all of us. We spoke about water, the stunting of children, and happy that there's more emphasis now on water and sanitation, actually, but also the relation with food security, with climate, the gender differences that Doris brought up. Oh, the new love. I almost forgot the new love from the beginning. The things that can happen in lockdowns. And Pascal ended with interconnectedness. We can't get around that anymore. Something happens in China and we're all affected. Something happens in South Africa. We're really one and the same in this world. If you would like to actually read more, you can't get enough of these insights, you can go to the ISS websites and look for the Research Insights section, where researchers of ISS share their latest, greatest findings in bite-sized formats. Also, all the researchers here will, you can read more, you can read blogs, etc., if you're interested in specific topics. As we close, we also have a few last questions for you, because we're just so curious about how you experienced this episode, what were key insights for you, and how can we make the next one even better for you, because we love really like building these bridges. So you can scan this QR code that you will see in front of you with your phone. Just put your phone camera on it, and that will take you to a little survey that you can fill out in 2 minutes. But we'd love to hear your voices in that. And as you fill out your survey and share your thoughts with us. And before we go to drinks here, we've chosen a song for you to end with, and it's called Stand Together. It's an African anthem of solidarity against COVID-19. It's several African artists brought together by one.org. And that's really the point, right? Stand together. So here's to unity, to solidarity, to collective care. And to seeing you next time.
Everything is changed nowadays. Funny how we can't even play no more. It was only yesterday when we party every day. Now it's blood on the dance floor, all because of the virus. But it can't kill the power inside us to stand together and defeat Corona.
And now we are qalbara nahani nqulu hanya dabba things are changing لكل قلب نرد شوية نخرجوا إن شاء الله نعيشوا إن شاء الله. Cause nobody's safe until everybody's safe. Tuamini nalo litakwisha, na tena tutalishinda tu. Tupambane hii vita, tumshinde COVID-19. Tuna kila sababu ya kuwajali wengine. Tafadhali tujilinde, tuwalinde, tuamue sasa.
One day my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us, cause nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Oh, everybody is safe. Oh.
Rain no go fall forever, sun goes to shine, my sister. We go beat Corona if we stand together. If we stand in solidarity, we don't go be too far down, far down. Yeah, me all Me, I like you and I know you like me too. Me, I love you and I know you love me too. We gonna spread the word and not divide us all. Feels like we're just leaving. We'll pick up the pieces, start over. All the tears will be all over. And you mean it will be much closer. For now we scream and shout. One day, my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Everybody is safe. One day, my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Everybody is safe.
Je passe un gros big up à tous ceux qui font le taf. Dans les hôpitaux, la tristesse sous les masques. Mister Corona nous a piqué dans la face. On a tous peur, quoi qu'on dise, quoi qu'on fasse. On va gagner, gagner, gagner. À nous la victoire, notre histoire, elle va changer. Tous les jours, les soirs, c'est la messe. Frérot, tu sais, Corona nous a tous mis dans la S.
Mothers are kings and fathers are queens. You reign in your quest for the truth and strive in your sleep. The people in your past can relate. Your victory great. I saw you on the shits in your graves. Your fathers relate. Many cries now, but they never beat the sunrise. Swinging in your fight, and we waiting for your come right. Your faith gon' heal you. Heaven gon' keep you. I'm praying that the sun never leaves you. I feel you here.
Hey, se não nos unirmos agora, tudo que construímos outrora, destruímos agora. É melhor nos munirmos agora. O futuro das crianças decidimos agora. Covid não escolhe cor, somos todos alvos. Enquanto não tivermos todos, ninguém tá salvo. A mensagem é básica, para não mudarmos o nome da Mama África para Mama Lágrima.
Lume alfa, skalvgun jallefa. Abro ketakalu, andu like a gomu, metada gichala. One day, my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us, cause nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Oh, everybody is safe. Oh. One day, my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us, cause nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Oh, everybody is safe. Oh. One day, my people, one day we'll be celebrating, cause this plague is over. Nothing will be separating us, cause nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Oh, everybody is safe. Oh.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.